Hi, everyone. It's me, Kathryn, and I am so excited to be back for another No CD Live. I have been coming on these No CD Lives for around actually a year now. So I've been doing this for a relatively long time. But just to kind of start us off, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself before I before I start answering any questions. So I guess the first thing is I'm Kathryn. I am 20 years old. I just finished my sophomore year of college. I live in San Francisco, California, and now I'm home for the summer. I'm studying clinical counseling psychology with a minor in women and gender studies. And I have OCD myself. I've been struggling with OCD for most of my life. And I think when I was around 16 years old, that's when I started to really talk about my experiences with OCD and really want to share what I've been through to help others, and just kind of found that it also really helped myself too, just really talking about it with other people, and especially with the OCD community. That's one place where I found so much community and so much relief, I guess, in just being able to share what I've been going through. So let's see. I'm looking at the questions right now. And it says one person said that they're currently showing there's a black screen. Can everyone see me, or is that just um, one's problem for one person on their end? I just want to make sure that everyone can see before moving on. But yeah, I am here today to answer any questions. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm here today to answer any questions, and just wanting to let you know that this is all from the perspective of someone with OCD, and not a professional. So I'm really wanting to, I guess, speak on behalf of my own experiences, but not necessarily from someone who is a licensed clinician. And just without further ado, I guess I will begin answering some questions. Okay. And just to confirm, this live will be saved on the No CD YouTube page, as well as the No CD Facebook page. So anyone can go back and watch it at any time. Okay, and it looks like everyone can see me, so thank you for that. Okay, let's see. Here's the first question. Can OCD affect the way you do things, like reading, daydreaming, and things like that? Can that go away with treatment? So I think just to start us off, I mean, I'm sure everyone on here, especially if you do have OCD yourself, know how debilitating OCD can be and how it can impact truly every facet of your life. At least for me, I know that when my OCD was at its worst, it came to impact every single inch of my life. And it wasn't just necessarily just one specific area, even though that can be the case. Just kind of going back to the question, for me, it really impacted my reading per se. My main facet of OCD that I struggle with is perfectionism. And I've been in recovery for a while now. I started OCD treatment, ERP, exposure and response prevention, the gold standard treatment for OCD, when I was 15 years old. And now I'm 20 years old, and I have made significant progress. And I'm at the point in my life where my OCD still affects me, but not even close to the extent that it did multiple, even 2 years ago or even a year ago. It's gotten significantly better. And that is because of the work that I put in when doing exposure and response prevention. So just kind of to set that as a preface, but yeah, it really impacted my reading. Just for me, because of the perfectionism, component of my OCD, I felt that I had to read every single thing on the page. So I just couldn't read like the words on the page. I had to read every little inch of punctuation. So if there was like a sentence, I had to read like I had to be like, okay, the comma, and I had to say all those things to myself, or else they felt that I actually wasn't reading. And in high school, that was a really big, obviously, like being in school and being a student, you have to do a lot of reading. So that really interfered with my ability to get my work done, do what I needed to be doing, because I was just so focused on meeting the needs of OCD and just all these things that I felt that I needed to do, or else something bad would happen, or else I felt I would be a bad person. And a big thing for me was writing, and just feeling that I needed to have every word be perfect, and assignments that should have only taken a short amount of time took an incredibly long period of time that no one should spend on that specific assignment. And I think for me, it got to the point where I just really wasn't functioning. And a lot of that just got to the point where I felt that I really wasn't myself. I couldn't recognize who I was just because I was so OCD just overtook me and everything, and just, I guess, my freedom and autonomy. But when I did start treatment, when I did do ERP, I gained so much of the control back. I faced my fears head on, and I got to the point that I never thought I would get to. I just finished my second year of college, and that's something I never thought. I didn't even, for a while, even though we knew I could do it academically, just due to my OCD, we didn't even think I could do it at all, go to college, especially going to college away from home and being able to do so well in college. And I've proven to myself for just 2 years now that I've been able to do it. And that is definitely all because of my OCD, or because of doing OCD treatment, doing intensive ERP. Um, but just to say that even with treatment, those things won't go away forever. You're still, OCD is a chronic lifelong disorder. And what I like to say is, even though OCD may be lifelong and chronic, its impact doesn't have to be. So even if you're dealing with, even if you're having OCD your whole life, it doesn't have to impact you your whole life. So it will still be there, and it'll still be something that you may struggle with from time to time and have to do some exposures, go to therapy, continue taking medications, or whatever works best for your treatment. But over time, definitely the impact will lessen the more that you do treatment and the more work that someone puts in to it, but it'll still be there. And especially for me, I found that during like heightened periods of stress and anxiety, just and changes in my life, that's when my OCD tends to flare up. Okay, let's see. And what I always try to do is I try to answer, I feel like, the questions that most people can, that generalize to the greatest amount of people. So let me find some of those. Okay. Okay. How did you feel about talking about your OCD with your family? I share often with friends, but was ashamed to share with some family members. I think that is a really normal thing. I think that that is such a valid experience and could be really scary. And sharing and talking about your OCD, especially if, like, I feel like so many, and I know this was the case for myself, but so many individuals with OCD will feel shame, and that's just something that comes with the disorder, which it shouldn't, because no one should feel ashamed of their struggles and what they're experiencing, and these unwanted, just extremely distressing, intrusive thoughts, and how they don't say anything about us. But I definitely experienced a lot of shame. And I think for me, just because of how old I was when I was diagnosed with OCD, and just when it was impacting me the most. Because for me, my OCD was definitely impacting me when I was kind of in the prime of my teenage years. So my parents played a really, really, really big part in my treatment and in my recovery, which I'm so appreciative of. I know, because that's not necessarily the case for everyone. And I was so lucky to have that access to resources and treatment, which is something that even to this day, it's heartbreaking, but treatment is not accessible. And there are so many financial and systemic barriers that prevent people from receiving the care that they need. But going back to that, my parents were definitely a very, very, very big support system through that. But I think for me, kind of on the flip side, it was really difficult for me to talk to my friends and peers about what I was going through, just because I think that was like the biggest thing that I felt ashamed of, because I felt like they would never really understand it and that they wouldn't really get what I was going through. And that's kind of when I really started to share openly about it. I created an Instagram page, and that was really helpful for me just in explaining what I was going through to people, and just kind of to try to just share primarily from the point of my experiences, and just showing how much my OCD impacted my life, and just I think also just explaining to people in like ways that they would understand is something that really helped me. So just kind of framing it like, oh, just imagine like your worst fear, just being unable to escape, like your worst thoughts and fears, and them being on repeat, and just all these things about the impact that it has on your life, and the debilitating effects it can have on your ability to do things and just live and just, I guess, get to the point where you can achieve everything that you want to achieve despite having such a debilitating disorder. Um, and I think that I really found also that people really wanted to know like what they could do to help and how they could best support me. And I think there are so many incredible resources out there, especially for family members. Um, I know there are incredible resources on the NoCD website and Instagram. The IOCDF, the International OCD Foundation, has awesome resources, especially for families and just people being able to better understand OCD and just how to support a loved one with OCD. That can be really impactful. But I think just knowing that, for me, coming to the realization that no one would ever, especially if they don't have OCD, they wouldn't understand exactly what I'm going through. But that, I guess, just wanting them to understand the impact that it had on my life, and just the ability it had on, or the impact it had on my ability to function on a day-to-day basis. But I think that it's really incredible that you've been sharing that with your friends. But I do understand how anxiety provoking and how it can feel shameful, and wanting to share with other people and just fearing that judgment. But knowing that there's nothing to be ashamed of, and that you're struggling and your struggles are legitimate. And the people in your life will see that and understand it, even if it does take some time and repeated explanation. Okay. Let's see. This one. I'm starting ERP tomorrow and I'm getting nervous. What are your suggestions for just beginning therapy? So I think the main thing that I'd emphasize is that it really does take time. And I think that for me, I was really hoping that when I started ERP and when I started treatment for OCD, that that would instantly make my struggles disappear, and that it would just be an immediate fix. And I think that for me, understanding that ERP and OCD recovery and just the recovery process in general, whether it be from anything, isn't a linear process, and that it does take time, and that there are going to be ups and downs. And I think specifically in the context of ERP, I think just really understanding that even how counterintuitive it may seem, in like having to face your fears head on, and how that's going to make your anxiety eventually decrease, and is what's going to improve your OCD. I think that that was something that took a really long time for me to understand, just kind of thinking, wait, wouldn't I want to avoid what I'm doing instead of purposefully exposing myself to what just my thoughts or my triggers, or what specifically increases the intensity of my OCD. And I think for me, just really understanding that this is what I needed to do to help me, that was something that really took time. And I think just kind of approaching it from a point of just willingness. And I think that's something that is not talked about enough in the context of ERP treatment and recovery, but just someone's willingness to do it, and willingness to do exposures and partake in the treatment. Because I think that someone has to be self-motivated to a degree in order to be successful in their treatment, because there's a lot of, I think, also personal accountability that goes along with exposure and response prevention and just OCD recovery in general, and just kind of knowing, because eventually, and this is what it's come to for me, but because I've done ERP for so long and have been in treatment for so long, there are times where I will be in just a situation and kind of set up an impromptu exposure for myself, and just knowing that that just kind of becomes a somewhat automatic response over time. I think also just kind of doing ERP treatment from a values standpoint, I think can be especially helpful, because in the moment, because ERP is so challenging, I would be completely lying if I said it was an easy process and a quick fix. It definitely takes time, and it can be really draining and really exhausting. But also, I guess, having a reason for doing it. Just kind of for me, thinking about all the things that my OCD before ERP was preventing me from doing, and just the effect it was having on my ability to live life, and how I wouldn't be able to accomplish the things that I wanted to do, or have these relationships that I wanted to have, and maintain these friendships and connections with my family and friends, and knowing that these wouldn't be things that I would be able to maintain if I didn't do ERP. And for me, a big thing, a big value for me was getting an education, was finishing high school, going off to college, and building that life for myself, which I knew wouldn't be possible if I didn't do ERP, since so much of my OCD surrounded school and my academics and studying, and homework and writing and reading, and just really all of the above. So I think for me, just really entering ERP treatment from a values standpoint can be so effective, and just realizing, especially during the really difficult exposures, which will come with time. I mean, they're not going to obviously be immediate, and that's not what you're going to be starting with. But just thinking that, like, why am I doing this? Why do I want to get better? What is my OCD preventing me from doing? And I think that that can really make all the difference in just the way that someone chooses to approach their ERP. And just from a person who's done a ton of ERP and had a lot of doubts at the beginning, that it can, even though it's so scary, it is absolutely life changing. And all those feelings are completely valid. It makes so much sense, because it is really scary, and it makes sense that someone would be nervous about it, but that it can be so helpful. And it essentially gave me my life back, which is something that I never thought I would be able to have and gain that control for myself. So just knowing how worthwhile it is, despite all how difficult it will be. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I think this is really important. What is your training and background in treating OCD? So I mentioned this at the beginning, but I just want to reiterate it again. I am not a professional. I am not a clinician in any way. I am someone with lived experience who has gone through OCD treatment, who is an OCD advocate and knows a lot about OCD from my own experiences, and just from connecting with other people who also have OCD. So I am not in any way providing any clinical recommendations, but just purely from the standpoint of someone with that lived experience. And I think that that's something that I really want to emphasize, because I am not a professional, but I do have a really good understanding of it, just from living with it for a majority of my life, and being at the point in my recovery where I am doing really, really well, and have just kind of figured out OCD and all the tricks that it comes to play. But for professionals and those who treat OCD, NoCD is incredible, and they provide such amazing services. for individuals with OCD, and there's so many awesome, I know there are support groups, and they have an awesome Instagram page, and just so many things in these lives. And a lot of times there are professionals and clinicians who treat OCD for a living who do come on these lives, but there also are people who have that lived experience with OCD, and I'm one of those people. So I just wanted to, before moving on with answering any more questions, just emphasize that I am not a professional, just to make sure that everyone understands that. Let's see. Okay. Why do you think OCD tends to go after whatever is currently important going on in our lives? I think just knowing, I mean, I'm not entirely sure like the science behind it necessarily, but I know for me personally, as my OCD always tended to target the things that were most important to me. And I think that just understanding that OCD is ego dystonic. So, meaning that it goes against what an individual wants and what an individual values. And especially with intrusive thoughts, it's really important for people to understand that and how it doesn't align with what the person wants or values. But if they're having thoughts about harming their kids or their partner or whoever it may be, it's because they care so deeply about their kids that they're having these thoughts that completely go against their values and their ideals. And just the way that they approach life. I know for me, that my OCD always tended to target school. And for me, that was something that was really, really important to me from a young age. And even outside of school, I just loved to learn, and I loved, I guess, going to school and learning new things. And that was something that I always really, really valued. So I think that's what makes OCD so incredibly distressing, is just the idea that it really targets what we value and what we care about the most. And also that it'll shift over time, especially as our values and what's in our life is changing. OCD is going to change along with it. But I think just coming from the perspective of knowing that, like, even if OCD changes the way that it, manifests or presents itself, just knowing that you treat it the exact same way. So even if your OCD theme or the way your obsessions are changing, you still would want to treat and handle them and deal with them in the exact same way, which is with exposure and response prevention, and just really challenging yourself to just sit with the uncertainty, sit with the distress, and knowing that that is going to help regardless of what it is attacking. And just knowing that at the end of the day, that these, even if it is attacking your values and the things that are most important to you, it doesn't detract from how much you love your kids, how much you care about your partner, how much you care about school, how much, just all these different things. It's, even if it targets those things, it doesn't mean that you love or care about them any less. It just, I guess, speaks to how much you do care for them, which I know can be kind of something that took me a really long time to understand. But I guess really helped me in just learning to come to that point of accepting my OCD and accepting the distress that it would bring in my life and just what it chose to attack, you could say. Let's see. Okay. Have you heard about TMS for OCD? I actually did do TMS for OCD. So for anyone who doesn't know, TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. And I know that it can be especially effective for individuals who have treatment resistant OCD. And for me, I did kind of combine TMS. So TMS was like originally established for treating depression. And for me, I had a lot of things where I was considered like medication resistant. So even though I tried a ton of different medications and different like antidepressants and SSRIs and different anxiety meds, they really weren't impacting or having the impact and helping me in the way that they should have been. And so for me, I got to a point because I do have depression as well as OCD and other diagnoses as well. But I think for me, just it was something that my psychiatrist felt could be really beneficial for me, just especially when I fell into a really deep depressive episode. So I was mainly doing TMS to target my depression at the time, but I also used the helmet, which there's a ton of I think there's information about it on the IOCDF website, and there's a bunch of resources out there that explain it a lot better than I'm going to explain it at the moment. But I did do a combined treatment that targeted both my depression and my OCD, but I'm not entirely sure how much it affected or had an impact on my OCD necessarily. Just because I know that for me, I had done so much ERP and I continue to do a lot of ERP. So I knew that that was really having an effect on my OCD and really was the reason that I was seeing all the improvements. And TMS significantly improved my depression and is something that really, really helped me in that sense. But I know that this can also differ from one individual to the next. And just as medication, one medication can help an individual so much, and another medication can have absolutely no impact on a different person, that whereas the medication really helped another person. I think the same goes for TMS, but that was just my experience with it. Let's see what else. Okay. Have you ever experienced fear of not having anxiety? Like that there are stretches of time when I'm fine and then I realize that I panic. So this kind of goes along with one thing that's really common among OCD is just that whole idea of the backdoor spike. So that idea of kind of once your OCD tends to get better and the anxiety that you're having about like intrusive thoughts, an intrusive thought that you've been having for so much time isn't causing you as much anxiety as it originally caused you. And the idea that over time it's like, oh, this is really great that it's improving, but wait, I'm obsessing over the fact that I'm not obsessing about the specific thought that I'm having, that I'm not really feeling anxious when I'm having these thoughts. And that kind of puts people in this, I guess, loop or spiral. Why am I not experiencing the anxiety that I experienced before? Does that mean that I actually want to act on my intrusive thoughts now? And I think the same thing can go for just anxiety, and just especially if you've lived, I know for me personally, if you've lived with anxiety for such a long period of time and all of a sudden it feels like you're really not having anxiety, that can just feel really unnatural and just kind of unsettling, especially having that been your constant state and frame of mind for so long. And all of a sudden that totally shifts. I know that that can be really anxiety provoking for people. And I know that that can be really difficult, especially when you're like, wait, I'm finally getting better. I'm finally getting to the place where I'm not feeling anxious. And I worked so hard to get to this point. And then I start getting anxious about not feeling anxious anymore. And just kind of, I guess, just that fear of things shifting and changing and what that potentially would say about the individual and just the fear that it speaks to them in some way. And so just, I think that that's a very common experience, especially in the recovery process and for OCD in particular. But just knowing that even in that moment, you're going to want to deal with it the same way that you've dealt with, just kind of sitting with it and being, oh, maybe being anxious does mean I'm a bad person. Maybe it doesn't mean. Maybe it means that I actually want to act on my thoughts. So just kind of dealing with it in the same way that you've dealt with other anxiety. But I just know how frustrating that can be. And just being like, wait, why can't I celebrate the fact that I'm not anxious about this anymore? Why can't I just really just take a breather and be like, okay, I am feeling good in this moment? And I know how frustrating that can be. But I think over time, especially once not feeling anxious becomes a lot more normalized in your life, I think that just it not being there will become a lot less anxiety provoking, and that fear will begin to diminish. And I know that that at least happened for me. Let's see. Okay. Do you advise me to get treatment in my native language so I can express easily, or it doesn't matter? I think that this is really, I guess, a personal question and really depends um, on the individual and can really look different. I think that I know that NoCD provides excellent services, and I know that they do provide treatment in other languages. So I think that that can really depend on what you feel most comfortable with. And I think that would be something to talk with a clinician about and just seeing what their advice would be. Because I don't necessarily have, just especially since English is my first language and is the language that I do speak, I haven't had to deal with that necessarily. But I think that that would definitely be a question to either consult with about whether you're seeking treatment through NoCD or any other provider. I think that they would probably have a very good opinion on that. But I think just probably wanting to do something where you're feeling the most comfortable, especially when you're in a really anxiety producing and provoking situation, having to do really difficult things. But I think that would honestly be personal preference, but I think I would recommend just asking a professional and thinking about what their advice would be in that situation. Okay, let's see. Okay. Let's see. Trying to find some more questions. Okay. I have sensoriometer breathing OCD. Since this is not one of the more known OCD types, would it be harder to treat? I don't necessarily think it would be harder to treat. I think it's just really important what, just regardless of the subtype, is going to an OCD specialist, because OCD specialists just have a really firm grasp on what OCD is and all the ways that it can present, and how that it just doesn't present in the stereotypical contamination or perfectionism way, and that it can present in a multitude of different ways, and that it just doesn't look the same for anyone, and how it is really needs to be individualized. So I think that it doesn't make it harder to treat. I think it just is really important, because I know this can be something that a lot of individuals face, but they'll go to someone, a practitioner, a clinician, who says that they treat OCD, but they don't necessarily specialize in it. And that can be really counterproductive in the sense, and do a lot of harm, especially if the individual is not specifically trained in OCD or hasn't really experienced it in so many different ways. And I think that that's why it makes it so much more important to go to an OCD specialist, and just because they would know how to best treat OCD and how to individualize that treatment to that specific individual's needs, and just really figure out what's going to benefit them in their recovery. So I don't necessarily think the theme makes it more difficult. I think just someone's understanding of what OCD is what can make an OCD treatment more successful. So, yeah. Let's see. Okay. Is Googling a compulsion? That's my only noticeable one apart from mental ones. So I think someone said it later down in the comments, but anything can become a compulsion for OCD. And that anything that really is reinforcing the OCD cycle and really keeping it alive that is an OCD compulsion. And just knowing that, I know for so many individuals, Googling can be a really big compulsion. I know, especially for people who deal with health OCD and just that fear of getting sick, especially contamination OCD. We'll look up their symptoms, we'll look up their thoughts, we'll try to seek reassurance. I know that there are certain Facebook groups where individuals will try to seek reassurance. So there are so many different ways where something can become a compulsion. So I think that regardless of what the behavior may be or what you're engaging in, just really understanding the way that it interacts in your OCD and the way that it goes along with your compulsions and just your themes and how it keeps these patterns alive, and how it really actually has a detrimental effect on your recovery process, and how that it can really just fuel the OCD cycle, and how it doesn't help in any way to break it, and it provides that temporary relief. But I know that that can be a really common compulsion for many individuals, especially since Google and any type of search engine can be so accessible, especially on phones or laptops or tablets or anything. It can be a really common one for individuals. Okay. Let's see. Okay. How long does it take for a person who begins OCD treatment to feel better? I think that this really depends on the individual. I think that I think for me, it took a while, and I think just knowing that OCD can impact an individual's life in so many ways, and that it's not necessarily that straight trajectory that I guess an individual wants, which is just a part of the recovery process. And I think for me, it my recovery journey was just very kind of all over the place, in the sense that I started doing ERP. It wasn't really working, but it was because I was just going to an individual once a week. And just based on the severity of my OCD, we realized that I needed intensive treatment. So I went off to residential treatment. And I think that's when I started to see a lot of the progress, but I was also doing really intensive ERP. So I was doing it all the time. And it was something that I was focusing on, to the point where I was living away from home just to focus on treatment and get that help that I needed. So I think it's really dependent on the individual. And it also, I guess, but when you do start to see that progress, and even it can be so small. And I think that that's just the point, that is just progress is progress, regardless of how big or small it may seem. And I think that that's something that is just can be so wonderful, is just seeing it for yourself, and just coming, just when you're in your own life, and just all of a sudden seeing like, wait, this is easier for me to do now. This is something that I couldn't do before. And just seeing that for yourself can be one of the most rewarding things, and just can make you realize, wait, this is why I'm doing ERP. This is why I'm doing these really, really tremendously hard things. And this is why it's helping. And just seeing that can be one of the most incredible things. But yeah, I would just say that it does take time, and that it's not immediate, but that it can really happen. Just the more work that you put in, the more you're going to reap from it, I think. And also knowing that OCD recovery and treatment is not linear. And for me, I faced relapses in my treatment, and have faced times where I felt that all my progress had been erased, even though it hadn't. And even if there are those bumps, one thing that I really found important for myself to recognize is that even though I may be struggling with something that I thought I had gotten over before, I'm entering, treatment from an entirely new perspective and have so many more insights than I did previously, and am much more aware of the way my OCD is presenting and how I can best deal with it, and how I can best, what types of treatments or exposures will benefit me the most and benefit um, just my OCD recovery the most. So I think that just recognizing that even if there are those setbacks, that it doesn't take away any of the progress or any of just the goals that you've reached thus far. Um, let's see. Okay, I know I've been talking a lot about ERP, and I know for some individuals, especially everyone can, start OCD treatment and recovery at any point in that. For some people, it's something that they know really, really well, whereas for some people, it's something that they're hearing about for the first time, which makes sense just because sadly, even when talking about OCD, it's not necessarily the first thing that people hear of. It takes them a really long time to find out about ERP and how it interacts and how it works. So I think just kind of breaking it down, ERP stands for exposure and response prevention. And ERP is the gold standard treatment for ERP. So there'll be professionals and clinicians who say, like, oh, this can help OCD, this can help OCD, this can help OCD. ERP is what has been, it's an evidence-based treatment, and it's shown that it really, really works. And from my own personal experience, I can say that it completely changed my life, and essentially it saved my life in so many other ways. But just kind of that whole idea of just looking at the OCD cycle and how there's, the obsession, the thought that someone has, and that causes someone to feel anxiety. And then someone will want to reduce that anxiety and just take away the fear or distress that they're experiencing. And they do that by performing a compulsion. And so that can be a physical, just visibly observable compulsion, or it can be a mental compulsion. It can really look like so many different things for people. And people will do those behaviors or compulsions to reduce that anxiety and give them that temporary relief. But because that relief is only temporary, they are going to soon be faced with another obsession. And if then they're just going to keep on following through with that cycle. And what ERP tries to do is break that cycle. So for many individuals, if they're having an obsession, it's kind of just even in the phrasing itself, exposure, response, prevention. So the whole goal is to prevent kind of the initial response that an individual has that fuels the OCD, and kind of doing directly the opposite of what the OCD wants. So just kind of that idea of if an individual, I know for me, with my perfectionism, just feeling like I couldn't make mistakes, purposefully making mistakes in that situation. And, the compulsion for me would be having to read something over a bunch of times. And the response prevention would be not reading it over at all and just turning it in as it is. And just kind of the whole point, and this can look really different from one individual to the next, just based on the way that their OCD presents and just what type of exposures would be most beneficial for them. But regardless of the individual, it's all about breaking the cycle. And I think that just knowing that any type of engagement in the cycle and just not that deliberate breaking of the cycle will fuel OCD and can just make it more debilitating. Okay. Um, okay. I think I'm going to answer about like one more question. But this one's a really great one. Can OCD be about who you are or your brain telling you that you're a certain person who's bad? I think that that is a really common fear because I know for at least my experience, OCD always likes to convince us that we're the exception. That we're, even though OCD is ego dystonic, even though it doesn't speak to who we are as an individual, you're the exception. And I think that's something that so many people with OCD experience. And even with that, just knowing just to sit with that uncertainty and how that's going to benefit someone the most in their recovery. So if they're having these thoughts about, oh, I am this really bad person, I am the exception, just kind of, I guess, um responding with, yeah, I might actually be that person, I may be that really bad person, and just kind of sitting with that uncertainty and just knowing that you don't know, you could be that exception, but just also knowing that that is a very common OCD response. And just OCD is quite the trickster and plays all these mind games and just knows the way, I guess, to best um, cause an individual distress and anxiety, and just really, I guess, twist your thinking in so many ways. And that was what it was like for me. And just even though I had these insights about what was true for other people, and it's like, oh, if someone else has an intrusive thought, they're not a bad person. That's just something that they're experiencing. It's just a thought. It doesn't mean anything. I'd be like, well, but it means that I'm a bad person. I would kind of single myself out um, from what I'm experiencing. So I think that just kind of bouncing off of other things, you're not necessarily agreeing with your thought. You're just kind of, thinking that that could be a possibility. And I think that's the main thing with OCD, is learning how to sit with that uncertainty of just not knowing. Like, my thought could be true, my thought could not be true. I don't know. And the response prevention is kind of really putting yourself in that purposefully anxiety provoking situation and just having yourself sit there with whatever thought you're experiencing. And that can look really different from one individual to the next, just based on their type of OCD, which is why OCD specialists, especially the ones here at OCD, can be so helpful just in really helping an individual to figure out the best way to target their OCD and the obsessions and intrusive thoughts that they're having. But yeah, I hope that this live was beneficial for people and gave some people new insights. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here. And I love coming on here and just sharing my experiences with OCD and hoping to help people through their own battles with OCD, because it's certainly not an easy one. But I just wanted to say that you all are so incredibly strong. And even though OCD can make us doubt our self-worth, who we are, our values, if we're even strong enough to face it, you most certainly are. And I just want to wish you all a good night and have a great rest of your day. Bye.